Hello, my name is Horrorama, and today I have found a few strange stories and encounters from various subreddits and will be narrating them here. But before we begin, I did want to ask that if you end up enjoying my narrations, then please do consider liking and subscribing, as that really does help the channel a lot. But either way, without any further ado, let's get into the narrations. The first story has been posed by user Theputsuo. I used to stay at my grandparents' house a lot when I was younger. They wanted to help out and such. They owned this 40 or 50-acre farm with their house about a quarter-mile into the woods. It was summer, and we all were going to bed. But I always have had trouble falling asleep, and was the only one awake, and was returning from the bathroom to join my cousin on the top bunk, with me in the bottom. The bedroom had one window facing a light post my grandparents had installed. I was just covering myself up when I saw something cast a shadow against that window curtain. Once, then twice. It was fast, but I could tell there was something moving outside. I crawled out of bed, hugging the floor, already terrified. I was about a foot from the closed curtain, with my eye just above the window sill. I stared out, and nothing happened for a few seconds. But then, I saw a figure cast a shadow onto the curtain. It looked like a big dog head, long snout, pointed ears. It stopped perfectly center of the window frame, and then slowly turned its head to face me. I froze, but it then raised up a few inches to show its shoulders. I can only describe it as a wolf head on a human body. Then it just turned away and moved on. People said I was young and that it was only a nightmare. It wasn't. I remember this too vividly. I forgot to mention that this window was about 5 feet up from the ground. It was my mother's old room as a child, and when I asked her if she ever saw anything, she paused for several seconds and then began to speak, shook her head, and stuttered out a no. She knew the folklore and refused to speak, so we had no choice but to drop it. But I knew why she would respond that way. Never mention these things aloud. I can't explain this. I'm still scared to be alone at night there. Even typing this gave me goosebumps. The second story has been posed by user rainy_weather123. Most skinwalker sightings occur in the US, but I have heard a few allegedly true stories of similar shape-shifting entities here in India. I have heard stories from my grandfather and my mother's grandfather about their encounters, to be exact. Here I will narrate my great-grandfather's, let's call him John, story. It happened in the 50s, and in those days, the population of the area we lived in was quite low, so adjacent villages were quite far from each other, and the main mode of transportation were horses. One evening after sunset, John was returning home on his horse on a very lonely road. There was nothing but farmland and trees on both sides as far as he could see. Suddenly, in the distance, he saw a large, white lamb looking animal just standing in the middle of the road, facing him. There were a lot of jackals in the area, so John took pity and decided to carry the lamb home along with him. He approached it and picked it up, placing it on his horse, such that the animal was in front of him, on its side with its legs dangling across either side of the horse. It must have been half an hour after that, when it was getting a little darker, that John heard scratching noises coming from below the horse. He looked and saw that the legs of the animal had seemingly grown so long that they were literally rubbing across the road as they were moving. He got so scared that he just threw it across the road and quickly ran away on his horse. But that, unfortunately, didn't end there. When he was close to his home, but still not inside the village, he saw a disgusting looking woman on the side of the road who started running alongside him. She was begging him to let him on the horse continuously. She ran away when human settlement came into view. John got a high fever after this incident and was on his bed for a few days. He is now very old, and he himself told me this story. I think whatever he saw pretty much matched the qualities of a skinwalker. What do you think? The third story has been posed by user appropriate:@:2272. A few years ago, two friends and I went backpacking in Rainbow Lakes in Idaho. The trip started on June 16th, 2022. We drove up the mountain to the trailhead, and no one was there. We were probably 15 miles from the next person. As we hiked up the saddle of the mountain and into the next valley, there was what sounded like someone hitting a tree with a branch as we entered the forest. There was still plenty of snow under the trees, with no trail visible. We had GPS, however, so finding the lake was no issue. This, however, also made it difficult for anyone to know where we were. We walked over deep snow and made it to the campground, fine. The whole time we walked, I did feel sort of strange. There was no sound other than our steps and the occasional creak. I, however, disregarded this because of all the snow. We set up camp and had one tent for all of us, a cramped 3-man. One friend and I had plans to build and stay in a shelter, which we soon made. As it got dark and heavy winds started to come through, the only light was the coals getting stoked by the wind. But soon, there was a blue light on the tops of the trees. I looked out of the shelter to see a blue light go across the sky without any sound, no more than 50 feet above the trees right over us. My friends had seen the light as well. We got spooked, and soon all of us were in the tent. While trying to fall asleep, I started to hear footsteps around our campsite. Now, I'm no mountain man, but I'm also not new to the outdoors, and I knew that whatever it was had 2 legs, and not 4. The strides were long and slow, stopping around our campsite, and even getting a couple feet from the door of the tent. I was too scared to move muscle, except to get my hand up close to my exposed ear. All it did was pace around for about 45 minutes, stopping occasionally. The wind was still blowing and pushed in the tent with a couple of gusts. At some point, the footsteps just trailed off, and I woke up that morning feeling terrible. I asked my friends if they had heard it as well, and one of them corroborated my story. The other slept through the entire thing. I opened the tent to make breakfast and heard a crack upon the mountain. In my opinion, though, this was likely unrelated. We searched for footprints and did find some, but what was weird, that there wasn't enough. We only found 3, one solitary and the 2 in a stride, probably 4 feet apart. The problem is that they were in snow and there were no other footprints remotely close to them, so we disregarded them. That morning, we all had a feeling of dread, and once again, there wasn't even a single sound. The friend that slept through it was the least scared, and when he went up a hill to take care of his business, he looked down to see 2 trees moving opposite of each other, like something was shaking them. There wasn't any wind anymore, and only those 2 trees moved. I said we should pack up and get out as soon as possible, as we were supposed to stay there 2 more nights. They agreed, and the whole way back, and ever since waking up, we felt like we were being watched. As we left the trees, we heard a single smack against a tree, like we did on the way in. But luckily, the rest of the trip back went smoothly. The 4th story has been posed by user Optimus Blender. This happened 9 years ago, in the early spring when I was 15 years old. I was at a friend's house in Corn County, about an hour north of Indianapolis. Nowadays, I am very familiar with the paranormal and unexplained, having multiple shared experiences with friends, but at the time, I was a major skeptic. I had not even heard of skinwalkers. I didn't fully process what we saw until years later. I came over to my friend's house to hang out like any other time. I brought my pellet gun. He had one as well, so we could shoot some moles on his farm property. After a while, his brother joined us, and we eventually got bored. There was a patch of woods about the size of 2 football fields, a little over a mile away, completely surrounded by empty cornfields, with no access points from the nearby road. The 3 of us decided to walk out there, because, well, why not? We were bored kids looking for something fun. We put on some boots and headed out with our pellet guns. The walk wasn't super far, but it did take us a while to reach the woods, because all the spring rain from earlier in the week made the empty field a big mud pit. So muddy, your foot disappears with each step. Then, right as we walked through the brush surrounding the edge of the woods, we saw it. The best way I can describe this thing is that it was a raccoon that was built like a Great Dane. We had seen coyotes and wolves before, and this was not that. It 100% looked like the biggest raccoon we had ever seen. We could tell we caught it off guard, because it was just standing there on all 4s, grooming itself, and then it immediately locked eyes with us, and when one of us pointed at it and said, "Look at that thing," there was a couple of seconds where we just looked at it, as it looked back at us, before it quickly turned around and scaled a 60-foot tree. We lost sight of it in the canopy. We then looked at each other and were like, what was that? And talked about how the way it climbed the tree was what freaked us out the most. It took only a few strides up the tree, using its front two paws to grab a spot on the tree, to lift and launch itself up the tree. The arms were freakishly long and lanky looking when it climbed. It honestly looked somewhat human, the way it articulated its arms as it climbed. Like its elbows jutted out to the sides as it pulled itself up. We talked about how freaky that was, and decided to keep looking around, because even though we were spooked, it was interesting, and we wanted to see if there was any other freaky stuff around. And there definitely was. The woods were littered with easily over 100 animal bone piles. Most of them were cows, raccoons, and opossums. There was one spot, maybe 25 by 25 feet, that had at least a dozen cow carcasses, ranging from just a bone left to one that looked less than a week old. They were definitely being eaten by something, with huge chunks of flesh being missing. I know cows get loose all the time, but damn if this didn't look like a feeding spot. My theory is that this thing was stealing cows from local farms for food. There were a couple within about 5 miles. We also found a man-made small pond near the middle of the woods. It couldn't have been more than 6 feet wide. There was a shovel and plastic bucket sitting next to it. Once we found it, we were pretty freaked out again and decided we better head back because we had less than 2 hours of daylight left and there was a lot of thick, deep mud to slowly walk through to get back. And that's pretty much it. At the time, it freaked me out a bit, but looking back now, knowing what skinwalkers are, I'm just happy we came back completely unscathed. Unfortunately, I don't hang out with those guys anymore, and I tried to go back with some different friends, somewhat recently, only to see that the woods had been cleared out, and there was nothing there. I thought I was tripping out, but I looked on Google Earth and could see in its place was dirt and log piles. Probably an omen to not chase this thing. I'll take it at face value. The 5th story has been posed by user Dohi014. I lived on a big family farm. Before a dispute amongst distant cousins, I could ride my bike to the furthest point with a road and still encounter family. One end was my house, the other was my great-grandmother's house, and between us was one big incline that led up and to the rest of the hundreds of acres. That was to the left. On the right side was a field with a dried creek, trees growing and dying along where they once had water. This was the bottom of the property, split by a small dirt road, sandwiched by a main road. In the fall, I could see the main road past the field and through the trees. This was late spring, early summer. I went past my grandma's house to enjoy a cool ride in the overshaded path. The overgrown field, sometimes full of flowers on my right, made it all the better. As soon as I left the hot sun and the canopy blanketed me, the temperature changed drastically. I was expecting cool and shady, not bitter, and to see my breath. I had this horrible weight to my guts, and I was overwhelmed with fear. My fight or flight was screaming at me to get away from there and to not to look right. My fear was overwhelming, and I couldn't help but turn my head as I realized I could hear the dry grass crunching along with my crunching of gravel. The tall grass was bending in a way that was indicative to someone running through it. The grass was between 4 and 5 feet high. The possibilities are endless for what it could be. As I swung my head back to make sure I wasn't going to crash as I increased speed, I realized there was a second trail in the grass. I nearly stomped on my brakes to observe, still panicking. I came to a halt, sliding on the gravel. An animal screamed, and I noticed the muzzle of a deer, or at least what looked like a deer, break the top of the grass. As a clear scuffle broke out, the grass moving appropriately, I sped off again, not wanting whatever predator to choose me for dessert. I hid at my great-grandma's house in one of her outbuildings. Someone had to come get me because I was so scared. They didn't understand and just gave me a hard time for taking their time. It took me 4 years to ride my bike back through there, and I only did it once more out of pure necessity. The overwhelming fear and dread I felt was gone as soon as I was past there, out of the canopy, and in the next clearing, in the sun. I couldn't hear any of the noises when I caught past, even though I was only maybe another 100 yards down. It's hard for me not to think it's supernatural in some way, because less than 300 feet away from me, where the prey was taken, is a cemetery for children. A very small plot. In fact, only 4 are buried there. I've also been told my entire life that the animals I could have possibly seen are far more likely after dusk. To see them just after 1 p.m. is fairly odd. I don't have any reason to return, but I still shudder and shake at the idea of being alone on that small stretch of dirt road again. The dread I felt that day was suffocating. The supernatural is very strange. I say this because during my time as an enthusiast, I've noticed that these creatures have eerily human-like habits. For example, a dogman knocking and scratching at your window to get your attention, just to scare you and then leave. Or a Sasquatch stalking you from the tree line, but never approaching close enough to be seen clearly. How are these strange habits any different from a human child with a temper tantrum just trying to get their parents to pay attention to them, or the rebellious actions of a teenager committed just for fun? Of course, ignoring the obvious differences, such as one being a child and the other an 8-foot tall beast. But either way, I do hope you enjoyed my narrations, and even if you didn't, I want to wish you a good rest of your day.